Article review on the reality of trade, the World Trade Organizations and developing countries, presented by Saujan Baniya and Pradeep Timalsina. Chapter 1, background information on the World Trade Organizations and impact of the Uruguay Round on the multilateral trading system. Chapter 2, Canadian trade. Chapter 3, European Union. Chapter 4 and 5, Japan trade and United States trade. Chapter 1, the 146 member countries of the World Trade Organizations are currently engaged in a round of trade negotiation. The Uruguay Round of multilateral trade negotiation 1986 to 1984 was an important milestone in over 50 years of GATT WTO history. The Uruguay Round is a complex agreement that covers 6 broad areas. 1. Traffic reductions in manufactured products. 2. The traffication of non-tariff barriers in agriculture as well as binding commitments to reduce the levels of agricultural protections. The elimination of voluntary export restraints and quotas in textiles and clothing. Institutional and rule change such as the creations of WTO and safeguards, anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures. New areas such as trade-related investment measures, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, and the general agreements on the trade in service. 6. After areas receiving greater coverage than earlier, such as custom valuation. Conclusion of policy implementation. The overall impact of the Uruguay round trade negotiations on the multilateral trading system was mixed. It brought some really significant institutional change, which have resulted in a relatively better governance of the world trading system under the aegis of WTO. Integrations of the world economy, especially the integration of developing countries into the multilateral trading system, contributed to the liberations of developing countries over trade regime and improvements in the conditions affecting access to the major market for their export product. Conclusion of Chapter 1. Openness to trade has long been seen as an important element of good economic policy. Trade liberalization can be a positive contributor to poverty alleviation, sharing the fruits of global trade expansion with the poor countries. For the world's 2.8 billion poor, reducing barriers to agricultural product, textile and clothing, apparel and several other labor incentives manufacturers are crucial, but the high and middle income countries will have to reduce their levels of protection in agriculture. Chapter 2, Canadian trade. 67% import and 87% export to USA. The importance of exports for the Canadian economy grew from 25% to 43% of GDP in 1999. The share of import into Canada originating levels from developing countries grew from 7.4% in 1990 to 11.1% in 1999. This growth is highly concentrated and mostly reflects Canada's increasing trade with two countries, Mexico and China. Mexico enjoyed duty-free treatment on 77% of its export to Canada in 1998. At a regional level, Asia represents the biggest source of import from the developing country to Canada, with more than 45% of developing countries impact to Canada compared to only 30% less than 10 years ago. Barriers to trade and preferential access. Import to Canada from developing countries are subjected to higher tariff than imports from developed countries. The reduction in tariffs resulting from Uruguay round did not change this state of affairs, as the reduction offered to developing countries were usually similar to those offered in industrial countries. In 2001, Canada collected almost 1.3 billion of tariff revenues on imports from developing countries, almost 45% of all its tariff revenues. Conclusion of Chapter 2. The Canadian government should make the step toward development-friendly trade policy by supporting greater flexibility in the application of the current agreements in all developing countries, not only the least developed countries, and by making sure the future agreements do not make their governments impotent as economic actors. Chapter 3, European Union. The European Union is a political and economic union of 28 member states that are located primarily in Europe. EU policies aim to ensure the free movement of people, goods, services, and capital within the internal market, enact legislation in justice and home affairs, and maintain common policies on trade, agriculture, fisheries, and regional development. The European Union provides more foreign aid than any other economic union. Trade policies of European Union. Generalized system of preference. EU implemented its first GSP in 1971 and it has been renewed annually. The EU GSP has been mostly relevant for those 9 LDCs and some developing countries that are not part of the ACP group. The GSP preferences are granted for a given product as a percentage reduction of general MFN rates. The reduction depends on the sensitivity of a product, on the extent to which the product competes with EU products, the economic situation of that country or sector, and competition with the manufacturing sector in the European Union. African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, ACP. Roughly 94% of total ACP exports, 100% of industrial products and 80% of agricultural products enter the EU on a duty-free basis. The agreement also guaranteed export earning to a certain extent within the framework of stabilization agreement for raw materials and minerals. European Union will provide financial support to offset any export losses as per the ACP contract. Everything but arms, EBA, a package of trade measures that grant 48 LDCs special access to the EU market for all their products. This initiative followed the announcement in June 2000 to grant duty-free access for essentially all products from LDCs at the latest by 2005. Full duty and quota-free access for all goods except arms. Chapter 3, Japan Trade. The United States is still Japan's biggest trading partner, but between 1990 and 2000, its shares of product to Japan fell from 31.7% to 32%, and its shares of imports from Japan slipped from 22.5% to 19.2%. Meanwhile, imports from East Asia have been growing rapidly, particularly from China, which shares was only 5.1 in 1990 but climbed to 10.7% in 1995 and 14.6 in 2000. Japan measures imports since the 1960s has been crude and partially refined oil, but manufactured products have accounted for increasingly large shares since 1990. Much of the growth in imports from East Asia has been because of offshore production by Japanese companies and outgrowth of expanded direct investment, an important reminder of the link between international trade and investment. Barriers to trade and preferential access. The Uruguay Round resulted in tariff reduction on an unprecedented scale in Japan. In all, approximately 11,000 tariffs were revised. Custom duties as a percentage of total import value fell from 3.4% in fiscal year 1994 to 2.4% in fiscal year 1999. Japan final average bound tariff rate declined to 1.5%, much lower than the rate in the United States 3.5%, the European Union 3.6% and Canada 4.8%. However, tariffs remain high for certain developing countries' export. The remaining barriers tariff peaks about 15% are in textile, footwear and most importantly in the agricultural sector. Chapter 5, United States trade. Since the end of Uruguay Round, developing countries' imports into the US have increased, and they now represent a bit more than 38% of all US imports. The tariffs on imports to the United States from developing countries are generally low, but they are higher than the tariffs applied on imports from developed countries. The United States uses extensive systems of quotas to limit developing countries' access to its domestic market in the textile and clothing sector. The level of international trade is still relatively small in the United States in comparison to other industrialized nations. Exports represents only 10% of United States GDP, whereas in the United States and Canada they amount respectively to 26% and 43% of GDP. Thank you very much.